A child's cry cuts through the darkness of Lagos. Not from a home, not from love, but from a pile of garbage. Tonight, 6-year-old Eve will discover that being saved isn't always the same as being wanted. Step into a world of wonders with Tales with Jenny. Don't forget to subscribe and click the like button. The night Ife was found, Lagos was restless. Not loud the way it was during the day, but uneasy. Like a city that never truly slept, only tossed and turned. The air smelled of burnt plastic, old rain and rot, the kind of smell that clung to the throat and refused to leave. Somewhere near a refuse dump behind a row of abandoned shops, flies buzzed angrily around torn black nylon bags, and rats darted in and out like shadows that had learned how to survive in filth. It was there, beside a heap of discarded food, broken bottles, and yesterday's life, that a sound cut through the night. Not loud, not demanding. Just a weak, trembling cry, like something that wasn't sure it deserved to be heard. At first, the woman walking past thought it was a cat. Lagos was full of them. But then the sound came again, thinner, human. She stopped. Her heels sank slightly into the wet dirt as she turned back, heart tightening for reasons she couldn't explain. "Did you hear that?" she asked her husband, her voice suddenly unsure. He frowned, scanning the darkness. Another cry followed, barely there. Together, they moved closer, covering their noses against the stench. When the man pulled aside one of the nylon bags with a stick, the world seemed to pause. Inside, wrapped in a faded cloth already stained with refuse, lay a small boy, tiny but clearly 6 years old, shivering, alive. His skin was pale beneath the dirt, his lips cracked, his fists clenched like he was holding on to the last thread of existence. The woman gasped, dropping to her knees without thinking. "Oh my God," she whispered, tears flooding her eyes. Someone threw him away. The boy cried again, louder now, as if he had been waiting for permission to live. They didn't know where he came from. There was no note, no explanation, no name, just a child abandoned among waste, like he had been judged and discarded before he could even speak a word. The woman pressed him to her chest, ignoring the smell, the dirt, the questions already forming in her mind. "We can't leave him here," she said, almost fiercely. "We can't." Her husband hesitated, not because he didn't feel the weight of the moment, but because he understood what this meant. They were wealthy, yes, comfortable, known. People would talk. People always talked. "We'll call the police," he said quietly. "We'll do things properly." She nodded, but her arms tightened around the boy like instinct had already chosen for her. At the hospital, under bright white lights and hushed voices, the boy was cleaned, fed, examined. "He's lucky," the nurse said softly. "Another few hours, and he wouldn't have made it." "Lucky." The word echoed strangely. The couple signed papers, answered questions, promised cooperation. Days passed. Then weeks. No one came forward. No frantic mother. No grieving family. Eventually, the boy came home with them. They named him Ife, meaning wealth, not because of money, but because they believed a life saved was treasure enough. In their large, quiet house, Eve slept in a bed far too beautiful for where he had come from. The woman sat beside him at night, watching his chest rise and fall, whispering promises he could not yet understand. "You're safe now," she would say. "You're ours." Eve adjusted quickly, as children do when they are fed, bathed, and loved. He learned to walk on polished floors, learned to speak in a home where voices were soft and measured, where laughter was controlled and tears were quickly wiped away. Neighbors admired him, the handsome boy with bright eyes and neat clothes, the child who had appeared almost like a miracle in a house that had once been too quiet. At school, teachers praised his manners. "Such a well-raised boy," they said. Eve believed them. He called the man daddy and the woman mummy without hesitation. To him, there was no before. No bin, no darkness. Just bedtime stories, warm meals, school uniforms neatly pressed, and the belief that this was what life had always meant to be. Sometimes at parties, people would ask jokingly, "Is he your first?" The woman would smile tightly and answer, "Yes." And Aoife would smile too, unaware that there were truths being folded away quietly, like documents locked in drawers no one intended to open. On his birthdays, candles were lit and wishes were made. On holidays, photos were taken. In every picture, Aoife stood proudly between them, convinced that he belonged in the frame. But belonging, like love, is fragile when it is not protected by truth. Somewhere beneath the polished surface of their lives, a silent difference existed, one that Aoife could not see, but that would one day rise like a crack in a perfect wall. The change did not come suddenly. It never does. It arrived softly, disguised as joy. The woman became pregnant. The house buzzed with congratulations, hospital visits, baby showers. Aoife watched from the edges, curious but excited. He was going to be a big brother. When the baby arrived, cries filled the house again, but these cries were welcomed, celebrated. At first, nothing seemed wrong, but slowly, things shifted. The woman's smiles became thinner, her patience shorter. Aoife was no longer pulled into hugs as often. When the second biological child came, the distance widened further, invisible but undeniable. Words like blood, lineage, future began to appear in conversations that stopped abruptly when Aoife entered the room. He didn't understand the looks, the sighs, the way silence followed him like a shadow. He only knew that something he couldn't name was slipping away. At night, lying in his bed, Aoife would stare at the ceiling and wonder why Mummy no longer kissed him goodnight, why Daddy was always busy, why he felt lonely in a house that once felt warm. He didn't know that love given without legal roots can be uprooted when fear enters the soil. He didn't know that the same hands that lifted him from a bin were already preparing to let him go again. And somewhere, deep in the quiet spaces of that beautiful home, a decision was beginning to form, one that would return Aoife to the very world he had been rescued from, only this time with memory, hope, and heartbreak fully intact. Aoife noticed the change long before he understood it. It didn't arrive with shouting or slaps or locked doors. It arrived quietly, disguised as joy. The day his foster mother returned from the hospital carrying a newborn, the house filled with visitors, laughter, and gifts wrapped in shiny paper. People spoke in excited voices, congratulating her, touching the baby's cheeks, calling him the real heir. Aoife stood beside the staircase, neatly dressed, smiling because everyone else was smiling. He waited for someone to call him closer, to ask him to carry the baby, to say, "This is your brother." But no one did. His foster mother barely looked in his direction. When Aoife tried to hug her later that evening, she stiffened slightly before patting his shoulder instead of pulling him close. It was subtle, small enough to be ignored, but something inside Aoife shifted. That night, lying on his bed, he told himself he was imagining things. Families grew, love expanded. That was what he had been taught. As months passed, the house rearranged itself around the new child. The sitting room became a nursery extension. Conversations changed tone. Aoife's name was no longer called as often. Where he once sat beside his foster mother during dinner, he was now told, "Go and sit properly." His food portions became smaller without explanation. His mistakes were corrected sharply. "You should know better," she would say, her eyes hard in a way they had never been before. When the second biological child arrived 2 years later, whatever warmth remained drained completely. Aoife became careful with his words, careful with his movements, careful with his happiness. He learned to disappear into corners, to finish his chores without being noticed. The house that once felt like shelter now felt like ground that could shift at any moment. Still, Aoife clung to hope. He told himself parents got tired. Adults changed moods. He told himself love did not vanish. It only slept. School became Aoife's only safe place, until it wasn't. One afternoon after classes, he returned home earlier than usual. The house was quiet. As he passed the hallway leading to the study, he heard his foster parents talking. He didn't mean to listen. He stopped only because he heard his name. "We made a mistake," the woman said, her voice low but sharp. "He's growing. People will start asking questions." The man sighed heavily. "We helped him. That should count for something." "Help," she snapped. "We picked him from a bin, from trash. And now you want him to share inheritance with my children." Aoife's heart slammed violently against his chest. He pressed himself against the wall, breath shallow. "We never adopted him legally," the woman continued. "He has no right here, no blood, no claim." The words "bin child" landed like stones. Aoife felt his legs weaken. The floor seemed to tilt beneath him. In that moment, the past rearranged itself in his mind. The half-hugs, the missing smiles, the distance. It all made sense now. He stepped away quietly, like someone leaving a graveyard, and returned to his room. That night, he cried into his pillow without sound, mourning something he didn't even know he was allowed to grieve. The expulsion did not come with warning. It came on an ordinary night. Aoife was woken by the light switching on abruptly. His foster father stood by the door, face unreadable. "Get dressed," he said. "You're leaving tonight." Aoife sat up, confused, terrified. "What did I do?" he asked. The woman stood behind him, arms crossed. "You've overstayed your welcome," she said flatly. "No explanations. No goodbye. No mercy." They handed him a small nylon bag with his old clothes, the ones he had outgrown. The gate opened. The night air swallowed him whole. Aoife stood barefoot on the pavement, the house lights glowing behind iron bars. He waited. Surely they would call him back. Surely this was a test. The gate closed instead. The sound echoed. Aoife didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just stood there, 9 years old, holding a bag, staring at a home that had erased him in one sentence. For the second time in his life, he had been thrown away, only this time, he remembered everything. The streets did not recognize Aoife when he returned to them. Not at first. They had no memory of the clean clothes, the warm bed, the school uniform neatly folded every morning. Lagos only saw a small boy standing under a flickering streetlight, clutching a nylon bag like it was the last proof that he had once belonged somewhere. Cars passed without slowing, music thumped from distant bars. Somewhere, people laughed. Aoife walked until his legs hurt, then walked some more because stopping felt more dangerous than moving. When the night air grew colder, he crawled under a bridge with other boys whose eyes had learned not to expect kindness. No one asked his name. No one cared why he was there. One boy laughed when Aoife said he used to live in a big house. "Everybody for this street was once rich," the boy scoffed. Hunger came quickly. Not the polite hunger that waits for mealtime, but the sharp, angry kind that twisted his stomach and made his head spin. Aoife curled into himself and tried to sleep, listening to the sound of water dripping and rats moving freely, wondering how a house full of light could disappear so completely in one night. Morning exposed him. Daylight was cruel in ways night was not. People who once greeted him warmly now looked through him like he was air. Some stared too long, recognition flickering briefly before shame forced them to look away. Others laughed openly. "See him," a woman whispered to her friend. "Is that not the boy from that big house?" Aoife tried begging once. He hated himself for it immediately. "Please," he said to a man at a traffic light, voice barely audible. The man waved him away like smoke. By afternoon, Aoife was dizzy. He hadn't eaten since the day before. His throat burned, his lips cracked. At a roadside buka, he watched steam rise from plates of rice and stew. His body moved toward the smell before his mind could stop it. "Shift!" the woman shouted, pushing him away with a spoon. Humiliation wrapped itself around him tighter than hunger. By evening, rain began to fall, heavy, punishing drops that soaked his clothes and washed dirt into his eyes. Eve stood shivering beneath a shop's rusted awning, arms wrapped around himself, realizing that the street did not care how old you were or where you came from. It only asked one question: can you survive me? Days blurred into each other. Hunger became familiar. So did sickness. Eve developed a cough that rattled deep in his chest, the kind that scraped his lungs raw. Some nights, fever burned through him so fiercely he thought he would disappear completely. He learned quickly that crying attracted danger. Older boys stole from weaker ones. Men prowled at night with eyes that made his skin crawl. Eve learned to stay awake longer, to sleep lightly, to keep his back against walls. One night, while digging through refuse near a market, he found half a loaf of bread. It was hard and moldy, but he ate it anyway, tears running down his face as his stomach cramped in relief. "Is this my life now?" he whispered to no one. He remembered his bed, his books, his foster mother brushing his hair before school. The memories hurt more than the hunger. Hope became dangerous. Every time it rose, reality crushed it back down. And yet, something stubborn remained inside him, a quiet refusal to die, even when death felt easier. The turning point came quietly, as most important things do. One afternoon, Aoife sat beside a drainage canal, watching men collect plastic bottles into sacks. He noticed how they sorted them carefully, separating crushed ones from intact ones. When a bottle rolled toward him, instinctively, he picked it up. Then another. No one chased him away. No one shouted. That night, he returned with a small sack. By morning, it had weight. It wasn't much, but when he sold it, a man pressed coins into his palm. The sound they made, sharp, real, felt like possibility. Eve stared at the money for a long time. It wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. He had earned it. For the first time since the gate closed behind him, Eve felt something shift. The street had taken almost everything from him, but it had not taken his hands, his mind, or his will. And in that quiet realization, something dangerous was born. Determination. Aoife did not suddenly become strong. He became consistent. Every morning before the city fully woke, while the streets were still quiet and the gutters still belonged to the night, he rose from wherever he had slept and tied the sack across his back. The sack smelled of old plastic and dirt, but it also smelled like something else now: purpose. He walked familiar routes, eyes trained to spot bottles others ignored. Crushed water sachets, soda bottles half buried in sand, containers floating in stagnant water. His hands grew rough. Small cuts lined his fingers. Sometimes the sun beat down so hard his vision blurred, but he kept going. When hunger came, he drank water to silence it. When weakness crept in, he rested briefly, then stood again. At night, he counted his earnings carefully, coins first, then notes, pressing them flat against the ground as if afraid they might disappear. It wasn't much, barely enough for one meal, but it was honest. And honesty gave him something begging never did: dignity. Slowly, the street boys noticed him. "Bottle boy," they called him at first, laughing. Eve didn't respond. He worked. Laughter faded. Respect, cautious and quiet, replaced it. As weeks passed, Eve learned the language of waste, which plastics paid more, which buyers cheated, which days were good for selling and which were not. He watched older men closely, copying how they cleaned bottles before sale, how they tied their sacks, how they spoke confidently when negotiating prices. One afternoon, a man at the recycling depot looked at him closely. "You're too young to be this serious," he said. Eve shrugged. "I don't have time to be unserious." The man laughed, then paid him a little extra. "With that money?" Eve bought bread and tea, warm food, eaten slowly, gratefully. For the first time in weeks, his stomach settled. That night he slept without shaking. The cough eased, strength crept back into his limbs. It wasn't healing yet, but it was the beginning of recovery. With stability came memory, and with memory came longing. Eve passed his old school one afternoon and stopped. The gate was open. Students laughed, uniforms clean, backpacks swinging. He watched from across the road, heart pounding. He remembered classrooms, chalk dust, raising his hand confidently. That night, under a streetlight, he found an old notebook someone had thrown away. Most pages were torn, but some were still clean. He took it. With a borrowed pen, he began to write not stories, not complaints, but lessons he still remembered. Simple maths, English words. He taught himself at night, lips moving silently, determined not to lose the part of him that once believed in tomorrow. "They can throw me away," he whispered, "but they won't make me stupid." Education became his quiet rebellion. Years did not pass gently, but they passed. Eve grew taller. His shoulders broadened. His sack became a cart, then 2 carts. Other boys joined him, younger ones, hungry ones, children like him. He taught them what he knew, how to sort, how to save, how not to steal from each other. Eventually, he slept indoors first in an unfinished building, then a rented room with cracked walls and a leaking roof. It felt like a palace. He enrolled in night school, sitting among adults twice his age, listening carefully, asking questions. When the acceptance letter for university finally came, he stared at it for a long time, afraid it wasn't real. The boy they called a bin child had built something from what others discarded. Not just a business, not just survival, a future. And somewhere in the city, destiny shifted its weight, preparing the next chapter. Success did not announce itself loudly when it finally arrived in Ife's life. It came the way sunrise does, slowly, steadily, impossible to stop once it began. By the time Ife was in his late 20s, the boy who once slept under bridges now ran a modest but growing recycling enterprise. His yard sat on the edge of the city, filled with neatly sorted plastics, metals, and cartons, each pile labeled and logged. Trucks came and went. Workers, many of them former street children, greeted him with respect. He paid them fairly, taught them patiently, and insisted they stayed in school or learned a trade. At night, when the city softened, Eve sat at his desk reviewing accounts, his university books stacked beside him. He had not become rich overnight, but he had become stable, and stability felt like victory. In a quiet corner of his office hung a single framed sentence. "What was discarded can still be rebuilt." He read it often, not as motivation, but as remembrance. While Eve's life gathered shape and meaning, the house that once rejected him began to crack from within. The business his foster parents ran, once steady, once admired, started to bleed money through careless decisions and prideful shortcuts. Contracts were signed without thought. Loans were taken to impress friends. The biological children grew up without discipline, without gratitude, without direction. One dropped out of school. Another drifted into substances that swallowed both money and sense. The woman who once stood tall now spent her nights awake, staring at ceilings that felt too close. The house was still large, but it no longer felt secure. Arguments replaced laughter. Silence replaced celebration. The very future she had tried to protect was unraveling in her hands. Guilt has a way of choosing its own punishment. The woman's health began to fail quietly at first. Sleepless nights, trembling hands, a weight on her chest that no doctor could fully explain. She avoided mirrors because they reminded her of a younger version of herself, kneeling beside a bin, promising safety she never intended to keep forever. Sometimes, late at night, she imagined a boy's eyes staring back at her, not accusing, just disappointed. The question followed her everywhere. Where is he now? The answer terrified her more than any punishment. She began asking questions. She asked old drivers, former neighbors, anyone who might have seen him. Most shook their heads. Some laughed. One finally said, "I heard he works with waste now. Recycling, I think." The word waste hit her like a slap. It took months, but guilt is stubborn. She found him one afternoon standing in his yard, giving instructions to workers. She almost didn't recognize him. He was taller, broader, calmer, not the scared child she had discarded, but a man shaped by survival. She stood frozen at the gate until he noticed her. Their eyes met. The world seemed to narrow to that moment. She stepped forward, voice breaking. Yves. He did not move. He did not smile. He listened as she spoke about regret, about fear, about how throwing him away had been the greatest mistake of her life. When she finally fell to her knees, crying openly, the workers looked away out of respect. Yves waited until her words ran out. Then he spoke quietly. "I forgive you," he said. "But forgiveness doesn't mean return." He helped her stand. He did not follow her back to the past. Yves did not celebrate forgiveness. He returned to his work the same day, walking through the recycling yard with the same quiet focus he had built his life on. But something had shifted. The past no longer felt like a weight pressing on his chest. It felt like a chapter, painful, yes, but closed. In the weeks that followed, Yves expanded his operations, not for profit alone, but for purpose. He began hiring more street children, teaching them how to sort recyclables, how to save money, how to speak with confidence instead of fear. He paid their school fees, enrolled some in night classes, helped others learn trades. "I won't save you forever," he told them gently, "but I'll help you save yourself." The boys listened. They worked. And slowly, the yard became something more than a business. It became a refuge, proof that discarded lives could still produce value. Yves returned to the places that once broke him, not in anger, but in understanding. Under bridges where he once slept, he organized food outreaches. At dump sites where hunger once humbled him, he placed collection bins and offered paid work. People began to talk. "That boy who was once thrown away," they said, "he's helping others now." He didn't correct them. He knew stories carried power, and if his story gave someone courage to survive one more night, it was enough. The city that once ignored him now recognized his footsteps. His name appeared in newspapers. Environmental panels invited him to speak. Universities asked him to share his journey. Each time he stood before an audience, he spoke simply. "I'm not special," he said. "I just refuse to disappear." Far away, in a house that once felt powerful, silence reigned. The woman who betrayed him watched his interviews quietly on a small television, her body weaker now, her world smaller. She did not try to reach him again. Some doors, she had learned, closed gently but permanently. Her biological children drifted through life without direction, haunted by opportunities they never valued. Wealth did not return. Respect did not follow. And though no court ever judged her, the verdict lived with her daily. She had thrown away a child, and in doing so, had thrown away the best part of herself. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky orange, Yves stood alone on a bridge overlooking the city. Traffic moved below, endless and alive. He remembered the boy who once slept beneath bridges like this, afraid, hungry, unwanted. He placed his hand on the railing and breathed deeply. "You survived," he whispered, not to the city, but to himself. Yves did not belong to the bin, the streets, or the house that rejected him. He belonged to the future he built with his own hands. And as the city lights flickered on, one truth stood taller than all the pain that came before it. Destiny is not decided by where you are thrown away, but by what you choose to rise into.